Bo, thank you so much for joining me today on the show. I'm excited for today's conversation.
It's my pleasure, and I am as well.
Bo, let's get started with kind of your background and how you got into the real estate industry.
I grew up more or less in Greenville, which is where I live now. I moved here when I was 7. My mother was from here, so went to school through the public school systems here, then went to the Citadel in Charleston. And school was a constant struggle for me. They didn't call anybody by acronyms back then, so they just said I was hyper. But I knew I couldn't listen in school. I would set out to pay attention to a teacher or a professor once I got to college, and 10 seconds later, I would be fishing in my mind or whatever. And so, finishing school was difficult, and I didn't know what I wanted to do when I finished. I thought about law school, but my distaste for school precluded that in my mind. So I ended up, I was home hunting my senior year with a friend who's 7 years older than me. And he asked me what I was going to do when I finished. I said, I got no idea. And he said, well, you can come to work with me. And I said, what do you do? He said, I sell real estate. I said, okay. And so I asked him about that a little bit. And that's the first time I understood what commissions were. And because I did not have a W-2 other than college summer jobs until 17 years in business. So at any rate, I got started in the real estate business out of absolute default. That's what I would say.
Were you selling residential or commercial?
Anything, honestly, because land, really, because the market was of such size that it wasn't large enough to specialize, unlike a Dallas or Atlanta. Literally, I sold, the first sale I made was a house. The second was a piece of land and anything in between, because that was just the scale of things.
Yep. I've had a lot of folks on the podcast, but a lot of them are from more recent, generations. Let's put it that way. I'm going to say it in a nice way, and that's why I'm excited about today, because I think a lot of folks are going to learn something today. But what you,
that was really delicate.
That was delicate.
That was really delicate.
I've learned how to ease into those.
Okay. This is interesting. So 72 was my first year in business.
All right.
And I just for commissions again. I remember I made like $10,300, which doesn't sound like much today, and it wasn't that much then. But it was. I was pleased. The next year I made 3 times that.
Yeah.
And I saw this meteoric rise to stardom. Humility comes in large and small doses. This was a large dose. So I got married. 13 months later, my first child was born, and what's called the OPEC oil embargo occurred. And I went 14 months and I made zero, nothing. And it was difficult, obviously.
Yep.
But it's the best thing that ever happened to me in retrospect. It sure didn't feel like it at the time. So,
well, okay, then let's stay on that for a second, because you just nailed it.
Sure.
So what year did the embargo happen? And can you take me back to what your mind was like when you were at the top of your game, making triple the money, and then all of a sudden down to zero? Like, how quickly did it happen? Walk me through that.
That's a good question. So you started to sense it in the summer of 74.
Okay.
And specifically, I would say 74, 75, because the first paycheck I drew in 14 months was December 31st of 1975.
Okay.
And so my wife and I remember being able to go to the store, buy hamburger meat, and cook outside with neighbors was a big deal. Whereas I'd grown up playing golf. I'd been able to go to the country club. I was, a fortunate kid. All of that was not possible. I couldn't afford. Each night, each month I would get my bills paid. And in the commission business, whether you've got a fee forthcoming or not within the next 90 days or 120 days. And I knew I had no income. So I would get my bills paid one month. And you would think that would be a huge relief. And it was actually just the opposite. Because I knew I didn't have any income for the next month. And I would lie there and think, what am I going to do next month?
Yeah.
How am I going to pay my bills next month? And I remember thinking, you like this. Thank God I'm not 40 and going through this.
Yeah.
That was a distinct thought in my mind. And now whatever I've made since then, I'd give to be 40 again, but that's probably not going to happen. Yeah. So it was a very humbling experience, but it changed my perspective. As I said, it's probably, in terms of business, the best thing that ever happened to me, because it gave me an appreciation of risk that I wouldn't have otherwise had, honestly.
Can you maybe lean in even further? Like, what does risk mean to you now that you've been something from there? Because I think a lot of, and look, I started in 2005, but I was in college buying rental houses. So I went through one cycle, but I didn't have a ton of assets in a company and lots of employees. So I remember what 08, 09 felt like. But can you describe, from that embargo and that year, like, what does risk mean to you that maybe when you look at younger generations now, you're thinking they don't have a clue?
Ooh. Here's what I would say. So the reality is, my family was by no means destitute, but nor were they wealthy. So, and when you're young, you take risk beyond your capacity to absorb them in an extreme downturn. And the OPEC oil embargo was an extreme downturn. 81 was an extreme downturn when the prime rate hit 21 and a half. And so you're taking risks early in your career that you cannot digest if you do have, unless you're very fortunate.
Yep.
If you do have an extreme recession. And so I took risk after 74, 75 that I probably could not have digested had I had another 14 months without income. But I tried for them to be calculated as much as was possible. Since then, though, and I don't know if I had to put a date on it, I would say, well, I was involved in a successful, in relative terms, a very successful development about 79, 80. And so I made enough money then that I tried to never take another risk that could fully deplete my reserves, if you will.
Yep.
And since then, I really do. When I look at because the hotel business is not exactly risk-free, as you understand, yeah. And it's COVID evidenced well. But if there is a significant downturn, I want to be able to absorb those losses by reserves that I have on hand.
Right.
So that's kind of a simple description, but that has been my approach to risk since then.
And you've been through several cycles at this point. You mentioned earlier that kind of sense that you could sense it coming in the summer of 74. When you think back on some of these cycles, 08, 99, 81, 74, did they all come in the same 01? Did they all come in the same fashion? Could you sense them all coming, or did they all come unexpectedly?
Honestly, you do develop a sense of things. And I would say that, and I'm not a soothsayer, but in every one of those instances, and I can name them all, I had a sense of them forthcoming.
Yeah.
And, you can't avoid them, as you know.
Right.
But you can be a little more prepared, and you can reduce the risks that you expose yourself to in anticipation of those downturns.
Yep.
I was really fortunate, guys. I told you we had a good development project in the very late 70s, early 80s, and it was a good one. It was a lot development project, but I'd also gotten into, at the request of a guy who was a Section 8 apartment developer, I'd gotten in the securities business only because that licensing was required. So I got an NASD broker dealer license. So I was selling tax shelter real estate in the late 70s and early 80s. And that gave me a source of income that even during 81 was a steady flow of commissions.
Yeah.
So that helped as well.
Yeah.
But I mean, I sensed like I remember early in 07 saying to the guys here, I said, we had a bank that made a presentation to us on a loan. And when they finished, I said, because it was extremely competitively priced in terms and in rate. And I said, when you're offering that kind of loan to us, it tells me I need to be very aware of what's happening, because the deal was too good.
Yeah.
It was a better, and it was all that capital, as you recall, all that capital from every source chasing deals.
Right.
Be it banks, be it buyers, be it developers, lenders of all sorts, as you know. It just gives you, it makes you cautious because you've seen it before.
And I don't want to spend the whole time on downturns, but I think it's just fascinating. When it starts to unravel, what is the chain of events that usually happens? Banks stop lending, investors stop, putting money into deals. Like, from your sense, like what are the things that happen on the way down that make the market kind of clinch up and stop?
That's a good question. And it's varied, because I'm not avoiding your question. I'll answer it, but it some have occurred so rapidly, and others have you've eased into the downturn itself. And I think the depth and breadth is that's the big unknown. I say that good times make for bad decisions, and I believe that's true. Bad times make for opportunity. And if you had the wisdom and the insight to see the end of the downturn, you would have and had the capital, you would have the courage to make investments that are very opportune. The problem is, it's hard to see that. It's hard to know the end or the depth. So here's the way I think of it. There was the OPEC oil embargo. There was 81. And then what happened was, you had, starting in about 83 or 4, you had, is it related to my broker-dealer business? You had the rumor of what was the 86 Tax Reform Act. And that sucked the tax benefits out of real estate, really. It is, in my opinion, the single cause, or the primary cause of the S&L debacle, which was, not 89 to 91, call it. The tech bubble in 01, I mean, that happened, that came on very rapidly. So each situation in 07, that extended so long that there was so much pain for so many. Each one was different. Each one had its own characteristics.
Yep.
And so how you prepare, what you see, varied, honestly.
Yeah.
But obviously, you're trying to figure out, all right, how do I get to the other side of this? And you don't know when the other side is. What is it going to do in terms of depletion of reserves? Because you don't know how deep it would go.
Right.
We were so fortunate in our hotels in the Great Recession. I've never really liked that term, but it was a pretty damn great one, large one. I mean, anyway, you slice it. We did not have a single hotel that did not have positive cash flow, which is amazing to me. Now, the cash flows had gone down significantly,
right?
And so that was my greatest source, personal source of income. So it was reduced, but it didn't go away. And that was very unusual. Most of my peers, we were fortunate. We had really good hotels and good small drive-to markets. Most of my peers, my friends in the hotel business, that wasn't their experience. They were feeding hotels. We never had to feed a hotel. We actually did have cash flow. So
yep.
I'm not sure I answered your question, but they all are different. And so trying to sense what the opportunity is, each one felt different too, even though you might have sensed it coming. That's what I would say.
Okay. Well, I'm not asking you to sense anything, but are you sensing anything?
Yeah. I mean, it's not a comfortable time. From inflation, obviously, which we had hyperinflation in the mid 70s and 80. I mean, literally, LIBOR didn't exist in the early 80s, but you think about the prime rate at 21.5, or a home mortgage in the 14 to 15 range. Take the impact of that and filter it through the economy today and think about the impact it would have. Yes. And then you take the geopolitical risks. It's not a comfortable time now.
Yeah.
I don't know how it can be.
When rates went to 21%, where were they before and what happened? I mean, did literally everybody stop borrowing almost immediately on new loans?
Yeah.
I mean, that sounds so foreign as we sit here today.
Well, here's what. So in the OPEC oil embargo, I don't think the prime rate had ever been above 3. Don't hold me to that, but I think that's correct. And the prime hit 12. I believe it was in 75. That was unheard of. And so some people who had debt, they had no choice. I mean, the debt was getting adjusted to the prime rate because there was so much debt that was variable. So people's disposable income was either hugely diminished or they were reaching into reserves. And then so 81, when inflation, which is what we're certainly seeing today, I don't remember what inflation hit, but I believe it was a double-digit number. The prime goes to 21.5. There were people that had to borrow, and there were companies that had to issue debt. It wasn't a choice they had, and so you suck when that much of your income is going to service debt. It impacts everything. Disposable income, certainly for the consumer.
Yep.
And people had were at ages where they've had to, might be an overstatement, but buy a house. And I've got a young guy that works with me. Young is relative, Chris. He's probably about your age. And so his dad is an old friend of mine. And I remember him saying he had to borrow. He borrowed on his house, new mortgage. He'd bought a house at 14.5%. And so you'll like this story. This is a little long, but so having come out of that. There's a great book, by the way, called Psychology of Money. And if you hadn't read it. It's a great book. But he's got 20 chapters, and they're very defined as to what they're addressing. And he talks. One of them is about the time in which the formative years from a business standpoint, in which you were exposed to. So I remember thinking, if I can, having come through 75 and then 81, if I can finance a deal in single digits, so below 10, I'm going to lock it in. I'm going to lock it in. So we did. This is a great story. I could write a book on this. If I took this single hotel from start to finish, I could write a book. But I'll give you the short version. So we did a hotel in Columbia, South Carolina. It was built in response to an RFP. It was to be the convention center hotel in Columbia. It's a Hilton. It's got a Ruth's Chris in it. It's a great hotel. We went through all sorts of battles to get it done, but it's in the location is in what's called an empowerment zone. So the empowerment zone enabled us to issue tax-exempt bonds to finance the hotel. I'd never done that before. I've not done it since either. So our our pay rate on interest rate was 70% of LIBOR variable. So LIBOR was at 5.5 roughly. Our interest rate was 3.7 the day we closed the bonds. So I had the option to swap all or part, including none, of that issue. And this was north of $20 million. I chose, because the deal worked economically, and this gets a little bit back to risk. The deal worked economically at 3.7%, 70% of LIBOR. So I swapped for 10 years, I swapped the whole issue, fixing my rate effectively at 3.7%. There were some other costs related to it, remarketing fees and other things that the largest of which was, in order for the bonds to be marketable, we had to have a bank letter of credit. So we had a letter of credit from SunTrust, which had an expense attached to it, about 75 basis points. And then we had what was called a remarketing fee. So our all-in rate was about, call it 4.75. But I locked in that 3.7, the issue, for 10 years. So after that, you will recall that LIBOR was as low as 25 basis points. Had I floated that issue, had I chosen to float it rather than fix it through swapping it, I would have been paying about 18 basis points versus 375 basis points. But again, I was risk adverse. The deal worked at 3.7. I wanted to fix it. And I'd grown, my business life. I'd been exposed to those two extreme interest rate events, mid 70s and early 80s, where I was going, it was, to me, it wasn't even an election. But think about that.
Oh, yeah.
18 basis points versus, you got it.
That's like free money.
That's like free money.
Okay.
So I've never gone back to figure out, because it doesn't matter. And that's passe. We've refinanced that hotel. But that was a lot of money. That was a lot of money.
All right, we're going to get into hotel development, but I want to ask one more kind of question on this interest rate spike.
Sure.
When it went to 21.5% prime, and again, I've only looked at charts. I obviously didn't live this, but the chart looks like it went up really quick and down really quick.
It did.
So can you remember exactly how long rates stayed there and what was happening when things were at 21.5? Because as we relate it to today, where interest rates are moving up pretty quickly, and the Fed has kind of made a little bit of a announcement that they don't plan on stopping until things taper down. What happens in that 2, 3, 4, 6 month window?
Well, if it's only that long, we'll be fortunate. It would be, I'd preface
what 2
I'm
years.
ready to say with that. Yeah. Or yes. So, just think about it. It's simple. Be it a company or a consumer, it is sucking as those rates rise. You're paying more for what you're buying, number one, but you also, the interest, if you've got debt, which most people have some form of debt. So it's really a double whammy, inflation and higher interest rates. It sucks what you have the ability to do. It reduces it significantly.
Right.
How long it lasts, I think, personally, I think this is a longer term issue. I don't think it's a spike up and a precipitous drop back down.
Yeah.
But I might be wrong.
Yeah.
I will try to prepare for it as if it's not.
Yep. Okay. But things kind of slow. I mean, when interest rates are, I can't imagine having to refinance a loan right now if rates shot up to 21%. I mean, basically you're toast.
Because you've got, that's a really insightful statement, because you've got, we have, anybody does, that's in our business, have loans that are maturing. And lenders may want out of those loans. And if they don't want out of those loans, they're certainly not going to renew them at the current rate. So if you have rates go from, let's say, we've got hotels financed at as low as about 3.6. Fortunately, those were recent, so we don't have a near-term maturity, but we got some maturities coming up. And so you add 200, 300, 400 basis points to the interest rate, the debt service, what I used to call loan constant. These young guys look at me like they don't know what that is, but it's a pretty good definition of what the debt costs you to have. I mean, you double your debt service. You don't have to be real smart to figure out that does diminish your cash flow.
Yeah.
And lenders are also, lenders are, when things are unknown to them as well, they don't have soothsayers working for them either. And so they're more reticent to make loans. They're loaning at a lower loan to value. It makes for a difficult business environment.
Yep.
I don't care what your business is.
Right. All right, let's pivot to hotels. God bless hotels, especially in America. How did you get into hotel development? I know how you got into real estate, but how'd you get into the world of hotels?
I fly fished my way into the hotel business. There's some truth to that. So I do. I love to fly fish. And back in the mid-late 80s, I was trout fishing a lot. And I was spending time. I've got a really close friend, and he's a business partner in the hotels, who lived in Jackson Hole. And so I was spending time out there. We had bought an interest. Don't ever do this, by the way. We had bought an interest in a fly shop together, he and his brother, who's also a close friend of mine, and I. And so I was out there enough where I thought, I should be looking for some sort of business opportunity here. So, because even back then you could sense that Jackson had some energy to it. And so I started looking around while I was out there. I was out there for a week fishing and found this piece of property that was owned by a doctor in New York. And I actually remember his name. And so I got his number from the bank, called him up. I said, you've got a piece of property in Jackson that I would be interested in purchasing. And we were doing more retail then. Development that we were doing would have been, I'd never done a hotel. And he said, well, I've just given an option to a guy from California, and he wants to build a hotel, but he doesn't have his equity together. And so I got in touch with the guy, who aspired to build a hotel, and he was about 40% short on his equity. And so I borrowed on what's called a home equity loan. So that would have been in the late 80s. That probably my guess would be 8 or 9% was what. So I borrowed on my home equity loan, my house. Didn't make my wife very happy, but, and then I got 3 buddies, two of whom lived in Jackson, and together we put up the last 40%. So the first hotel I was involved in, I was an investor. And we opened that hotel in May of 90. We built it as a days in because days would give us we could get out of the contract in a very short period of time, like 60 days, which is unheard of today. And our fee was 2%. So, and we thought we needed a brand, which we didn't at the time, honestly. In retrospect, we didn't need a brand. But that hotel is the Hampton Inn today. So we opened the hotel in May of 90, and we sold it in May of 94. Yeah, that's right. And the proceeds from that, my share, gave me the ability to develop my first hotel, which also was a fly fishing experience.
Okay, how does developing a hotel work? Let's start with site selection. And more to your strategy. I know there's all types of hotels, but maybe start with what are y'all really? What's y'all's fastball, and how do you look for locations that matter to you?
We look at market opportunity first before we look for sites.
Okay.
And so what we have done best would be a bullseye for us in theory, because theory doesn't always work out to be reality. You've been in the real estate business, but in theory, a city with an ACC or SEC school in it, a capital city that didn't have, when we really first started doing this, who had a downtown that was starting to see some renaissance, but was not so far down that road that the great sites were gone. So we would try to find a market that had some underlying energy to it. Really, you had local government whose vision was to make their downtown better, cool. That had a great school that's associated with the city, and then we would try, and if we had those ingredients, we'd try to find a great site. And we were brand aware then, because I'd have to go back and count, but most of the early hotels we did were Hampton Inns. And so if we could find a downtown that fit into what I just described, that didn't have a Hampton in it, and we could find a great site, that was what we would have considered a bullseye. Not that every hotel we've done meets all of that criteria, but that was what we looked for. And so the exception to that, my first Hampton, the one that I was able to do after Jackson Hole, I was fly fishing in East Tennessee a lot. And I couldn't find a hotel room sometime. I thought, you don't really need a market study. If you can't find a hotel room, if you build a hotel here, that'd be a good choice. So I called what was then Promise Hotels and ended up building a Hampton up there. And that was the first hotel that opened June the 12th of 1995. That was the first hotel that I developed from start to finish.
Okay, so let's say we found a market, a great SEC school. To all my SEC listeners out there, Bo's coming to a market near you, but we found a market that you like. It's a government that's, pro business, pro, we want to have a great downtown, pro, we're going to make this easy for you. Then what do you look for in a site? Does it have to be walkable, next to water? Like, what matters when you're selecting a site?
It's market dependent first, but obviously, if you've got a river, you would like to be close by. You want to be walkable to entertainment, restaurants, and whatever. If there is a particular activity that the city or the town is known for, you'd like to be in close proximity to that.
Okay,
it's pretty straightforward.
When you think about a college town, and maybe the answer is very obvious, but who's your average guest? Is it parents coming in to see kids? Is it folks coming in to see games? Is it really seasonal? Or, how do you think about who your guest is? Or does it vary throughout the year?
It varies throughout the year. So, a large school has a lot of people that call on them, have a lot of people that call on them. So, you can do a tremendous amount of school related business that's not athletic, that's not academic specifically, because a large university just attracts that.
Yeah.
But, your premium nights, which in some markets, I learned that in Jackson Hole, your premium nights can make an economic model work, whereas it wouldn't work otherwise. So football weekends for a big school. I mean, we built, we're in Columbia, we were in Tallahassee, we were in Gainesville, Florida, we're in Baton Rouge. As for instance, as Greenville is certainly Clemson impacted. You get in probably 2012, 2013, we had built a hotel in downtown Gainesville, the Hampton Inn and Suites. We built it to own it, which is a long term, which has always been our objective. We sold it for a reason that doesn't matter, but it was a great hotel. But on a game day weekend, we would get a 3-night minimum at $450. That didn't happen. I wish that happened every weekend, but it only happened about 6 or 7 a year. So those premium nights really, not that Gainesville wouldn't have worked anyway, because it has a significant medical presence. But they can make a hotel work that wouldn't otherwise work. And the best example of that, I used to resent, this goes way back, I used to resent people of whatever business type who raise their prices when there was peak demand. I used to think that's crazy. That's abusive. Well, what I learned in Jackson Hole was that had we made 85% of our revenue in 3 months. Had you not been, and you at high rates, relatively high rates, today very high rates. Had we not done that, there wouldn't have been any hotels in Jackson. I had not thought through that whole equation.
Right.
So, but it's true. I mean, there's certain markets that rates have to be high at peak season, or there wouldn't be any supply. We enjoy those peak nights. They certainly make our those high demand nights. They make our equation better, but we can't live off those. So a big school generates a lot of different type of business,
yep,
including visiting teams, certainly. If that answers your question.
Yeah. Do you try and sign like contracts with the schools to get a certain amount of business, or you don't need to do that?
We don't do that.
Okay.
To my knowledge, and there may be somebody in our operations that would, where we have a relationship. We certainly we do try to develop relationships with the athletic department or so, but it's not contractual.
Right. All right. Market site. Do you then call Hampton Inn and say, look, we selected this great market. We think we have the right site. We're going to go forward. Or do you have to select the brand before you start building the hotel, or what's the order that things happen?
That's a good question, Chris. So we would have a brand in mind. We would look for an opportune market, but we would have a brand in mind. And so we would make a call to whatever company we were working with, and we thought that the brand we had in mind was owned by. And that'll take me down another road. But and we would call and say, look, we've got a good site, great site in such and such a market. And we're interested in building, let's say, a Hampton. And they would say, well, we just signed a franchise agreement with somebody else, or we're talking with somebody else, or yeah, that's a good idea. So it could be a range of answers, but our question would be brand specific. And then if there was somebody who was ahead of us, so to speak, but we had a great site and an opportune market, then we would shift brands.
Yep. What risk are you taking, and what risk are they taking?
Ooh. I would say us a
hot
lot and
question
them.
coming in.
That's a good one, though. I mean, today, us a lot. We take all the risk.
Yeah.
So I mean, Marriott's got, for instance, more than 30 brands, and that leads to all sorts of questions and answers. But they're a franchise, as is Hilton. They're a franchise company. They don't, they're not in the real estate business anymore. They sold their hotels, so they get paid at the top line level. They get paid a percentage of our gross revenue. We, on the other hand, as you understand, we've got to make money at the bottom line. That's the only way we make money. So
right.
We're investing our money to benefit them. They can mandate brand standards that add to our capital expense or our operating expense or both, that benefit them but cost us. So literally increase our capital expense and or decrease our net operating income, but increase the gross revenue, which is the metric off which they get paid. So I don't want to beat up on the brands because we've had great relationships with them. I was chairman of Hilton's Hampton Inn Brand Council for a long time. I've got a few good friends left there, but that's fact. And as the brands have expanded in terms, as the franchise companies have expanded with the added number of brands, it's diluted the reservation system. It's diluted the affinity programs. So they would tell you that, well, this brand, even though it's XYZ company, same affinity program, same reservation system, basically. It's a different swim lane.
Yep.
I say it's a hotel. I mean, they're hotel rooms. So you get it.
I get it. Okay, so
you get it.
When you're designing and actually building the actual structure, and Hampton Inn's already said, hey, we love your deal in Baton Rouge, we're in. Do you have to build the actual structure to their specs, or you can build it to any spec you want? Or there's just is there just a common spec that everybody knows is the right way to build it?
So we have, that's another great question, really. We have, as I alluded to earlier, we have built in urban settings. Urban settings not only allow you more flexibility from the brand's perspective in terms of exterior design for certain, and even interior design, because it needs to be cool, it needs to fit. And we, if I had to throw out a percentage, we'd probably spend 15 to 20% more. Let's use Hampton as an example, on our Hampton than one that's out on the interstate, because it needs to not look like a Hampton. It needs to feel like a boutique hotel. And if you look at our website, you would not recognize any of our existing hotels as a prototype.
Right.
Yeah, but when you get in the room, things change, and we can get, if we're in a historic market, let's say, we can get case good exceptions that are befitting that market. A dresser that looks antique. But there are certain criteria, dimensional requirements, that generally you have to adhere to. But we get a whole lot more latitude in urban settings and we pay for them, as I said, than a typical franchise may get. If you look on our website, you will not recognize any of the brands, if you just looked at them, didn't see the sign, as being a Hampton or a Courtyard or a Residence. I mean,
yep.
Typically.
Dumb question. What's an affinity program?
Points.
Okay.
Everybody's a points junkie. And so It's true. It's true. So, if you've got 3 hotels in a market that are drawing on that if you stay there, you get Hilton honors points, then that makes those points very valuable. And I'm not beating up on Hilton, but just as an example. But if there are 8 hotels that are all in honors, that dilutes the benefit.
Got it.
You get it.
Yeah. All right. The building is being close to completion. Let's say we're completed. The physical structure is done. Are you buying all the furniture, or is the hotel or is the brand putting in all the furniture?
We buy it all.
Okay.
We hire an ID. Now there are, again, there's some requirements, brand standards that we adhere to, some particularly in the room, more in the room than in the lobbies, in the public space.
Yep.
And it really depends on the box, but we'll have an interior designer who has done Hamptons or Hiltons or Courtyards or whatever before, so she knows standards. And those, the really good ones,
yep,
are in close contact and have friends at the brand level who are in charge of interior design. So we will typically have a company that does our ID, and that company may or may not do the purchasing for us. Sometimes they do, or sometimes we hire a company to do the purchasing. There's certain items that flow through. Hilton has a Hilton Supply, so there's certain items that flow through Hilton Supply, and theoretically they're price advantaged, but very little of that is on the front end of the hotel. It's more sheets, towels, pillow, that sort of thing.
It's not bad to be Hilton, is it?
Not just Hilton. I don't want to beat up on Hilton, because Hilton has been very good to me. And the only hotel that we're actually working on 2 deals right now. We just started construction on one. Both of them are Hilton brands.
Yep.
So, no, but the answer to your question, no, it's not. So in all honesty, and I think anybody in my business who's been in it a long time, would say this: it feels to me that we were once the franchise company's partners. We were their partners. We were developing their product. I think our relationships, as they have sold their real estate, no longer hotel owners, their allegiance, and you understand this, is to the shareholder. So next quarter's earnings feel more important than the relationship of franchisee.
Yep.
That's a pretty strong statement, and I really don't, but it's true. That's the way it feels.
Yeah. All right. A couple more things, and then I want to get into a few more topics. But last question on hotels, and I think you've kind of already answered it. But now that we're built, fully furnished, we're opening for business, what is Hilton providing you? What are you paying for? I know you're paying for a booking system, which is huge, and marketing. What else are you paying for? Or is that it?
They do. We pay for national advertising. We pay into, I think the current rate with Hilton is 4%. So 4% of our revenue goes into a marketing fund. That the affinity program is within that fund. I believe that's correct. My operations people could answer these questions better than I can. But they have national relationships. Hilton does with, let's say, IBM or Microsoft or whomever. And so in a market, they can give us penetration to those users, guests, that it may take us a very long time to develop, if we could at all, develop that ourselves. So that would be an example.
Yep.
Does that answer?
Yep.
Answer your question?
we don't have to spend too long on this. We've talked about inflation. Construction's kind of tough right now. What do
You think?
Well, yeah, I haven't met anybody building anything right now that has said it's a walk in the park. It's never been a walk in the park, but especially right now. Anything that just comes to mind when you think about building right now? What are y'all doing to stay on top of your game?
The hotel we just started, we started working on. We optioned the site 4.5 years ago. That's a long time. And you think about now that is an inordinately long time, and there are circumstances that cause that to extend longer than normal. But it wouldn't be unusual at all for me to start working on a deal, conceive an opportunity, and it'd be 5 or 6 years before that hotel opens. And I'm going to get to your specific question, but you understand this. So you think about a 5 or 6 year period that you're exposed to market change, interest rate change, recession, all sorts of risks. That's a long time to not have the puzzle tied up in a tight little bundle. A long time.
Yep.
So, in this case, construction, the project that I'm referring to, our construction contract is at about 170% of our original budget. Rates have not gone up 170%. Hotel rates. Now obviously we think it's an opportune market, but it's the first project. We have always done what I call heads up deals. So my partners are invested on the very same basis that Bo is invested. And so I put up my share of the equity. They put up their share of the equity. I guarantee my share of the debt. They guarantee their share of the debt. And my partners are, my fishing buddies or my hunting buddies. So they're not institutional, that's my point.
Right.
The project I just described to you is the first project that we've ever done, hotel project, that there's what I would call any sort of promotion to. And so we have a couple of local guys, great guys, local to the market, really good guys, and they will be partners with us, and they will put up more equity than their interest. In other words, they'll put up, let's say, 60% of the equity for 50% of the deal. And after that, it's heads up. So, and it's still, it's a very good opportunity for them, but it helps us it diminishes our risk somewhat.
Yep.
Certainly. It helps us get to an internal rate threshold that we're accustomed to. On paper,
Yep.
we hadn't gotten there. We hadn't gotten there at the bank yet, but on paper. And so, construction costs, and we're in the home building business too. And so you understand the trap that's there. I mean, early on when construction prices really started to soar, we had no protection. We pre-sell virtually everything.
Yeah.
So we had no protection in our contracts on material increases or labor increases. We do now, but that's not comfortable for the home buyer.
Right.
And I get it, but everybody, all builders are having to do that today. So there are a lot of ramifications to inflation.
Okay. One of your risks, or one of your competitors would be a new hotel to the market. But in the recent, call it last decade, there's been a small company called Airbnb come up, and short-term rentals are coming up. People are opting to stay in other folks' homes rather than, stay in hotels. Is that putting a dent in your business? Is it something you think about? Is it two totally different markets? Who's renting a Hampton Inn versus who's staying in a home? Like, what do you think about this kind of rise of the short-term rental owner?
We may have to have another podcast.
Yeah. Well, this is the last big segment, so let's just kind of riff on it.
It's market dependent, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I think that Airbnb is now, I think, the largest hotel booking company in the country. Hotel booking company.
Wait,
booking hotel rooms.
Really?
Yep. And so their model has morphed and evolved. But I think in terms of impact on us, it varies market to market. And there are a number of cities that have taken proactive steps because they don't want affordable housing to be diminished by third-party or short-term rental companies. They don't want that inventory taken out of the marketplace. They are, I think, also aware that lodging, as we've known it historically, is important to certain communities, that those properties remain healthy. So there have been a lot of municipalities that have taken proactive steps to limit, I guess you would say, the short-term rental market. Yeah. Charleston, South Carolina is a good example. And the different municipalities have taken different steps. But are they a competitor? Absolutely. It does vary market to market. Their struggle today, because of their critical mass, is consistency of delivery and keyless entry, which some of the major hotel companies have gone to. So they have their challenges, but they're a huge supplier.
Yep.
And you probably know this. I mean, it's not just Airbnb, but they are leasing blocks of apartments and new apartment projects in downtown Greenville in urban settings. And so they're running that block of apartments as you would a hotel, basically.
It's interesting.
It is interesting. And, I think we call it Airbnb for now, but I in several municipalities, I just thought it was important that foothold not get to be so strong that it would reduce a hotel's ability to have the revenues to stay fresh, crisp, attractive to guests. And I think that many municipalities understood that, because it takes, we set aside 5% of our revenues just to reinvest. We build, as I've said earlier, for long-term ownership. That takes constant reinvestment. We reinvest in our hotels well ahead of brand requirements. Yeah. Because we built them to own long-term. Well, if you reduce income, you reduce, and one of the things you reduce is your ability to do that. And so no great city wants their hotel inventory to be tired and worn and not as attractive to out-of-town folks. So, and I think that the direction of hotels, not just in reaction to the Airbnbs, but is to be more of a destination, to have more activity, be it lobby activity. Like the hotel we're working on right now has it'll have a really cool coffee bar. It'll have a 2 bars, music, 2 food and beverage venues. So it is, and rooms. It's more a destination than a contained destination, if you will, than the short-term rental companies can be.
Yep. One quick
Does
question.
that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. You said, the scale you're seeing now, especially in a world where labor's tight and, service providers' costs are going up. I saw something the other day where, they're charging $300 or $400 for a night for the house. The cleaning fee alone is $250 on top of it. I mean, you stack all the fees up on an Airbnb and it's more in fees and everything else than you paid to actually rent it.
Exactly.
That's not sustainable.
That's not sustainable. I tell you what, I mean, what you just touched on, and it's for us. I said the other day, I never thought that we would be looking harder for employees than guests. And that's almost the truth.
Yep.
And so yet our ability to employ, almost every market we're in, we have multiple hotels. And so our efforts to procure employees can be a little more refined and focused than the Airbnbs can. But yeah, the cleaning charges can be astronomical.
Yep.
And you don't know what you are going to get until you get there. Really, that's my experience.
Yep. All right. I got one more question for you. You already touched on it.
Easy.
It's easy. I'm going to throw you a change up here, just 50 miles an hour right down the center.
And tell me ahead of time that it's going to be that. That's important.
You said that you do heads up deals. And I'll be honest, in today's finance world, that's almost unheard of.
It's always been unheard of.
Why do you do it is the first question. And what do you look for in a partner that matters? You've probably seen a lot of partnerships over your time. And it sounds like you've ended up with the partners that you deserve, which are great folks that have stuck with you. But let's just talk about partnerships to bring it home. Why have you chosen heads up partnerships?
So I told you early on that I started an NASD broker dealer back in the late 70s. And it was at the request, really, of a company that was doing Section 8 housing and evolved into Farmers Home 515s, which were tax shelters. Out of that effort, I also did a couple of other things. I was always invested, Chris, as my partner. I was a limited partner investor on the same basis as those who I was selling to were, if you follow that. So, yep. But I strayed. So we did a couple of restaurants. We did an oil and gas deal. We did an equipment leasing deal. And those didn't all work out like I had hoped or expected. And out of that, I developed a sense that it was a whole lot more painful, unpleasant. I could describe it in a lot of different ways, to lose somebody's money for them than to lose your own money. Mm. So I would much rather lose my money on my decision than come to Chris Powers and say, Chris, I got this deal that I think's good. You invest and it goes back. So there was a period starting probably 83 or so, as I said, when sort of the rumor of the 86 Reform Act gutted what we were primarily selling, which was tax shelters. Well designed, really. I mean, it's a shame that program run away because it incentivized high net worth investors to invest in, create, and provide housing for the less privileged, but it did. And so there was a period that we really didn't have partners. I wasn't soliciting partners. When I started developing hotels, the first one, the one in Jackson Hole, I mean, these were my three buddies. That was different. I mean, I just went to them and said, look, we have this opportunity. But when I started to do it again, when I developed my first one, I did not want the burden or the responsibility, if you want to call it that, of having the deal not work out. And the guy who put up his money was not a part. He made the decision to invest, but he invested because of Bo. I didn't want it. It wasn't worth it to me.
Yeah.
And I needed partners from the outset. Had I had the capital to do it all by myself, it would have been different. But I needed partners when I started, for sure. And we still have partners today, and basically the same ones. Now Windsor Aughtry makes a development fee, which they earn, and we have a hotel management company that I have an interest in. I mean, very competitive in their pricing. So there's some benefit, if you will, beyond the investment. But in terms of the investment, I'm invested on the exact same basis as my partners, and it is because that's the way I wanted it. I have some younger guys in the office that think we need to change the model, and they'll have a chance to do that maybe one day, but not with. Look, it's been a great business for me. I've enjoyed it. It still stimulates me. My partners are my friends. If the deal doesn't work out, I lose money just like they do. And we've never had that experience until COVID. So we had a couple of, I learned a new term, Chris, you'll like this, you understand what a pay down, and when a bank calls you and says you need to pay this down. But I'd never heard the term remargining. So I now know what remargining is. So we had a couple of hotels financed with a large bank. And 6 months into COVID, our debt was maturing. Had not matured, but was maturing just in months. And so remargining means paying down the debt. So we had some significant capital calls on a couple of hotels. And I would say it was a whole lot easier to make those calls on my partner when they knew I was putting up my share just like they were putting up their share.
Right. I love it.
Well, I don't mean it in any sort of pure way, or that's just been my approach to it.
That's how you do it.
Yeah.
All right.
Sure.
Last one. I said that was the last one, but if you could go back, I'm 35 years old. If you could go back and tell your 35-year-old self some words of wisdom that you've learned along the way, what might you tell him?
There ain't no free. I tell the guys that there's nothing free. It may seem free at the time. I don't care what it is. There's a price to pay.
Yep.
It may be today or it may be tomorrow. The other thing I said earlier, and I believe it is good times make for bad decisions. So, when times are good, prepare for the bad times. When times are bad, prepare for the good times. And the trouble is, as we talked earlier, in downturns, it's having a sense of when things will start moving in the right direction again.
Yep.
But that's when the opportunity, that's when the greatest opportunity exists. So good times make for bad decisions, and there ain't no free.
I love it. All right, Bo, thank you for being so generous with your time today. This really was great.
I enjoyed it. It's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
And tell John to get his name on the bottom next time.
We will.
All right.
All right.
See you, buddy.
Bye, Bo.